Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jennifer Reeves, Senior Resident Fellow at the Mitchell Institute's Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence. Welcome to this afternoon's panel, Continental Defense in the 21st Century. Continental defense in the 21st century marks the next great evolution of homeland security. At its core is integrated air and missile defense, strengthened by today's proven architectures and tomorrow's emerging technologies. Together, these capabilities will shield our nation from threats across every domain: land, air, sea, space, and even cyber. This is a once-in-a-generation effort, and it will demand a whole-of-industry mobilization. That's why I'm thrilled to be joined today by 4 industry leaders to explore both the challenges we must overcome and the opportunities we cannot afford to miss. So to discuss this topic, I am joined by Steve Arnette, Chief Operations Officer for Amentum. Welcome, Steve. Robert Lightfoot, President, Lockheed Martin Space. Welcome, Robert. Dr. Rob Fleming, Corporate Vice President and President, Northrop Grumman Space. Welcome, Rob. And Ed Zoiss, President, Space and Airborne Systems, L3Harris. Welcome, Ed. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. And without further delay, let's dive into some questions. Air and missile defense isn't new, but today's threat environment is far more complex than anything we've faced before, even during the Cold War. Robert, can you unpack the threats facing the homeland today? Do Russia's strikes against Ukraine and Iran's air and missile strikes on Israel foreshadow what America could face?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have as a nation is we've had the advantage of the tyranny of distance. We've got 2 oceans separating us from other locations and from a lot of our peer adversaries. The difference now is they have capability to reach us. They can reach out and touch us in a way that maybe none of us are going to be comfortable with when we think about that threat. If you take that threat, the threat that they can reach us now, and you take the threat that we're seeing in space, where space has become a contested domain, it's an area where we, as a team, have to come together to see what we can do to protect our homeland. And I think the systems we have today were built for a different fight. And so that's the fight that we have to address. And I think, if you go back to some of the data that's been released by the Space Force in terms of what the Chinese have done to how many satellites they've put up, how many different things they're doing, the operations you're seeing in space that they're doing, there's a real threat not only to the space domain, which is pretty key to most of our terrestrial activities, but there's also a threat that keeps us from protecting the homeland with some sort of a defense mechanism that we got to put in place. So I think that's the threat. I think that's the difference. Everybody always asks, golly, we tried this in the 80s. What's different? I think what's different now is we're not as probably protected by those oceans as we were in the past.
So speaking of the past, our ballistic missile defense architecture of today is rooted in technologies really dating back to the Cold War. But as we've just heard, the threat environment has changed drastically. So Rob, why is it so important that we continue to improve our ballistic missile defense architecture in light of these adversary threats?
I think that's pretty self-evident, right, in terms of protecting the nation. And, to Robert's point, the threats are evolving quickly, right? We've been moving since the Cold War, advancing our capabilities, putting investment in as a nation, but really a lot of the solutions were focused on, a smaller problem set. It was more around sort of rogue nation and sized for those types of threats. And so as we look forward at the problem that we have now, to Robert's point, you've got fractional orbit bombardment systems. We also saw those publicly, circumnavigating the globe, presenting new kind of threats. There's a multi-orbit variant of that. We've seen from the conflict in the Middle East, raid scenarios where large numbers of weapons were launched by Iran in that case. Just really challenging and stressing on the systems. Now, as a nation, and my colleagues and I and the rest of the defense industrial base has a ton of capability that can be brought to bear. So, as we go after these threat sets, whether they're ballistic, whether they're hypersonic, whether they're in raid configuration, thinking about the C2, thinking about the ground systems, the fire control, the interceptors themselves, that's the substance of what needs to be done. I know we're up for it. I think we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that today.
Yeah, I think so. That's exactly what we're going to talk about. So we're not starting from scratch, as you mentioned, when it comes to continental defense. We have existing architectures and capabilities in place, but of course, we will need to expand and integrate new technologies. So let's hear from Ed, your industry perspective, and talk to us about this dynamic, and tell us about the opportunities it creates, as well as maybe some of the challenges.
Yeah, first I would like to agree with my colleagues here. Look, the threat is real. As Robert mentioned, the fractional orbital bombardment system, it did pose a threat that we hadn't seen before, a maneuverable threat, a threat that maneuvers around our land and sea-based radars, which is why we have to move many of the capabilities that have been traditionally terrestrial now up into the space layer to handle these complex threats. It'll also have to really bring AI and fast decision-making in order to counter these, very serious challenges to the homeland. That's really one end of the spectrum. I want to touch on another end. All of us have been watching what's been playing out in Ukraine. We saw how creative and inventive Ukraine has been to defend their homeland, against the threats that they're seeing. When we look at what happened with containerized systems of small UAVs near military bases, that really speaks to, the amount of containers and inputs that we get as a nation that comes through our ports. And it should all really give us pause that we have a lower tech threat in addition to this advanced high tech threat that we're going to have to face when we think about defending our homeland. Because oftentimes we talk about the exquisite threats. There are going to be low-tech threats as well that we'll need to have different processes, different screening methods for things that are coming into our nation so that we can avoid the type of tactical surprise that the Ukrainians employed with Russia. So a lot of different pieces are going to need to come together, from very low-tech to very high-tech to really put together this continental defense system that, our nation is contemplating.
Yeah, I agree, Ed. I think that's a really good point. It's a huge undertaking in the 21st century, very different than what we've dealt with before. And the infrastructure will likely span the globe. It will extend hundreds of kilometers from the Earth's surface into space. There's going to have to be some level of command and control. And let's hear from Steve about what that means for our existing C2 infrastructure and how it needs to change with our high-order threats, low-order threats, et cetera.
It's a great point. I think that it's worth, while we acknowledge, and all of the speakers have talked about the evolving threat, and the evolving threat is going to drive new layers and new capabilities that will have to come into the picture, as has already been mentioned. I think it is worth taking just a second to highlight how, if you look at today, our missile defense system, how much advance and how much great capability that has been built into that system, which can be leveraged going forward as part of future continental defense systems. I know that we'll have to add layers and capabilities. High tech and low tech has already been mentioned, but there's a lot there that we feel really good about. If we think about evolving the system in the future, kind of the governing principle, I think, is the rapid evolution of the threat, as has been mentioned. And it's creates an imperative for speed. So thinking about kind of the joint development enterprise spanning government and industry, I think some of what we hear, agile development, is something that's just going to have to be embraced by all, kind of common standards, data protocols, so that we can all from the beginning be working in the same direction, not get hung up with delays in integrating components, systems into overarching architecture. But also the recognition that because of the speed imperative, we will probably, and I think it bears saying, have to accept incremental more risk in the operational layer. We cannot let incrementally better or ever better become the enemy of good enough, and we'll have to really bake that into how we jointly develop and deploy.
Yeah, I think I've heard some leaders, actually, some military leaders talk about that exact thing at this exact conference. So maybe we should talk about some specifics. Hypersonic weapon systems are extremely difficult to track with today's space-based sensors. The Hypersonic Ballistic Tracking Space Sensors, or HBTSS, are designed to actually change that. So let's hear from Ed. Can you talk about the challenges hypersonic weapons present and how your colleagues at L3 Harris are working to confront them?
Absolutely. Look, when we talk about the Cold War threat with missiles, what we're really talking about is ballistic missiles. So if you know the trajectory, of the missile at takeoff, then you really know where it's going to end, the end point of it. That's not the case anymore with a hypersonic threat, because the hypersonic threat is a maneuverable threat. And so it's not good enough just to know what the ascent is at takeoff and plan the trajectory of the interceptor based on a ballistics, high school physics that we all took on a ballistic trajectory. These hypersonic weapons don't obey that. And so what we need is constant custody of these incoming threats. So we need to know where they're at all times. And in addition to constant custody, we need to be able to provide fire control coordinates now from the space layer. Because these systems, these new threats can maneuver around, as I said before, our ground-based and sea-based radars. And so we can't provide an interceptor lock necessarily from terrestrial means. It has to move into space. That was the whole purpose of the HBTSS system that was demonstrated on orbit. It was really moving that fire control layer to space in order to provide interceptors on the ground, those real-time coordinates for that intercept. So the system has been proven is successful. In fact, it was called out in the president's executive order. It was one of the only items that was called out with the word accelerate. If you go back and look at the executive order, it was the first part of it. It said accelerate the HBTSS system because it's so important.
God, that's spectacular.
If we could maybe just add one comment to the HDBSS, which, credit to Ed and team, that's been very successful. I did want to mention, thinking about the go forward, I know we have been honored to develop the ground system that supports HDBSS and everything from the space enterprise architecture to the hosting the software and operations and sustainment and all the rest. And the reason I mention that is HDBSS, certainly the advanced sensors and that capability that Ed mentioned, but even kind of the common ground space enterprise architecture are things that one could imagine taking advantage of and leveraging forward into future systems. So I think there's a lot there for us to harvest moving forward.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, I think now that you've done good, Steve, and broken the chain of just answering the question, we'll jump in and make this a dialogue. I also think one of the things we're going to have to do is we have traditionally bought kit in kind of stovepipes. And I think to get after the threat we're talking about, the multiple threats we're talking about, we're going to find that we have kit that was purchased for or acquired for a different reason that might have applications across these different things than what it was originally meant for. And we all work on systems that do that. The goal for protecting the homeland is going to be how do we stitch those together maybe in a different way. And that's where the C2 is going to become super important, not necessarily C2 of the individual systems, but the integrated C2 across. Because I think we will find, I know we will find certain kit today that maybe had this use, but can be used over here and it's already up there. And so that's going to be important for speed too, is leveraging what we already have in place.
Absolutely. Situational awareness, then followed by C2.
Yeah, and if I could add to that. So, I mean, it's been an evolving architecture, right? So if you look at the systems that have been in place that have defended the nation to this point, a lot of the strategic missile warning capabilities that have been the unblinking eye, that have really been designed for those original threats where we needed to understand, has there been a rogue nation ICBM launch that is ultimately going to require a decision by the president as to whether there's a response or not. And so what's happened over the last decade in particular there's been an evolution of the architecture from, I'll say, largely a HEO and GEO-based architecture to now integrate in other orbits at different altitudes for different reasons. And there's good physics reasons for all of these elements. And you've seen the Missile Defense Agency, you've seen the Space Development Agency, and all of our companies have provided solutions, whether it's HBTSS, like myself and Ed, tracking layers of which multiple companies here are participating, but all of these integrate together, and there's work to be done because there's objective architectures, and then there's the reality of we're just now getting into T1 launches for SDA, And then there's going to be T2 and T3 is going through the solicitation process. And all of this needs to then get integrated to these grade points so that we understand what the total picture is, what the C2 is, who's going to make the decisions. And there are lots of agencies with lots of handoff points that need to be resolved. So there's a lot of work ahead for the whole industry.
I think you're right. So let's go with another example of some concrete stuff here and talk about space-based interceptors. So they may sound a little more like science fiction than reality, but they're actually being explored as a way to engage threats earlier in their flight trajectory. So let's start with Rob. Can you help our audience understand where you guys stand, maybe the industry writ large, on space-based interceptors, and then when such technologies might even become operational?
I thought if I put my mic down that Robert would answer the question for me, but he didn't get the cue. Yeah, so I know, everybody wants to know what our solution, whether it's me or one of my friends here, what is our space-based interceptor answer and what is it used for? Clearly, in a nice open forum, we're not going to get into those conversations. It's an important part of the future architecture. And I think most importantly, to the earlier points about, from a sensing point of view, there are multiple layers. From an interceptor point of view, there are multiple layers. And so it's really a large system engineering architecture problem, and it's heavily driven by economics. So, early days, before my time, brilliant eyes, brilliant pebbles, some of the early work done on this topic set. You fast forward decades, we now have different technology, multiple companies, propulsion, low-cost buses, much more advanced sensors, system engineering tools that enable us to make trades a lot faster than we used to. So we have many more tools in our tool belts to figure out where we want to solve a space-based interceptor problem. But we need to work through all of that architecture to figure out the trade space between altitude, between effector, at what price point, etc. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's money involved to get that figured out. I would say that as a nation, we know how to solve the problem. We just need to navigate through some really important decisions.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, I also think the other enabler here is launch. We have better access to launch than we've ever had. If you go back to the 80s, we used to call them Christmas tree satellites. You got one flight a year, you put everything you could on that satellite, right? And it got expensive and tried to solve everybody's answer. Now we have the ability to refresh. We can put things up, we can refresh them quickly because the launch industry has come along as well to help this situation. And I think to Rob's point, and to my other point is I think we have kit out there that we can piece together to get after the SBI for Missile Defense Challenge. It's just a matter of how we're going to, how can we put those together? And I think part of this is going to be multiple options. Give the warfighters multiple options, right? And if we can pull that off and do it in a cost-effective way, you're not relying on just one bullet, right? You got more options.
Yeah, and the threat is not just the threat in the brilliant eyes, brilliant pebbles days, right? As Ed was talking about, maneuverable, hypersonic, different orbits. So the architecture trade space is larger than it used to be, right? Again, we know how to get after it. Importantly, there is, again, to Steve's earlier points around the C2, the fire control, weapon target pairing, latencies that are involved, all the work that needs to be done. I would say that the defense industrial base is up to the task.
Oh, I love that. Well, Steve, let's talk about data. Continental Defense will generate enormous amounts of information, and turning that into actionable insight will be a major challenge. So where do technologies like AI and ML come into the picture, and where must humans stay in the loop?
It's a great question, and of course, as has already been mentioned here several times, we're upstream of specific solutions or even architectures, but I think there are, for the group today, maybe just a couple, 3 ideas that I hear people in the community talking about. And I think the first, if you think about an integrated continental defense system, and it seems as though we'll need to have some kind of, at the top level, I'll call it, a ground and software layer that is able to fuse data and create, an integrated picture of situational awareness, but at the same time, be able to hand off battle management to different regions, which is, something very different than we've known in the past. And I think the second idea that seems to, people are actively debating and thinking about is this idea of distributed command. If we think about the future and a potential raid scenario, if you will, no single node is going to be able to manage that fight. And so thinking about building in the resiliency and kind of the distributed command nature of future solutions, I think is even self-evident in some of the panel colleagues' remarks as well. I think that's absolutely going to come into play. The ability to shift control seamlessly and then allow, more compute and processing closer to the threat. And I think the last part, an idea that is certainly getting a lot of attention, this idea of how do humans fit into the chain. And humans do remain central. I think that will certainly always be the case. And it seems that if we think about artificial intelligence automation, there's to be able to leverage that capability to be able to, I'll say, triage and prioritize. But at the same time, and you can envision maybe giving the individual commander, quickly the situational picture, or even to have, optionality or recommendations, but humans are commanders to retain the judgment and authority to be able to approve or adjust or accept, but to be able to more quickly give them that picture and give them the optionality. So I think those ideas really come into play with data.
Okay, super. Yeah, definitely it has to be dealt with. So now we're going to ask a couple of questions and ask each panelist to give their thoughts on some holistic ideas here. In the event of an attack on CONUS, Continental Defense will need to defeat multiple incoming threats, not just one at a time. And we've talked about it. These could include ballistic and cruise missiles, hypersonic maneuvering vehicles, and even space-based weapons. So how do we build that overall system capable of handling that kind of threat volume? And Robert, let's start with you.
Look at me. I think the key is going to be defining the resiliency that we want. And resiliency can come in a bunch of different ways. You can talk to people about, I'll use space as an example. You can talk about making the spacecraft resilient, the single spacecraft resilient against all threat, or you can talk about the architecture that spacecraft is part of being resilient. And I think oftentimes we talk about the technical resiliency of the systems that we're talking about putting in place. I think part of the resiliency we're going to have is the industrial base of this nation, where we will have multiple options and multiple providers to do different parts of this mission. And I think when you think about if you think about this, again, I was at NASA for a while, so I always go back to the Apollo days. This is like an Apollo moment. Yeah. And back then, the government said, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, and you're doing this. And that's what we're going to have to do first to get speed. And then second, to hold each other accountable as an industrial base to meet the need that the nation has. So that to me is the resiliency, is that you depend on the whole of this nation, not just Lockheed, Northrop, L3, Amentum, anybody else you want to pick. It's all of us coming together to get after this threat and to help the warfighter get to the point that they can do this. One of the things that I'll pile on with Steve, part of this resiliency is, if you go back in time, we got maybe gigabytes or even kilobytes from space. Now we're getting flops. And we have got to give that's a human factors problem. Doesn't mean you take the human out of the loop, but you have got to help the human not get overwhelmed by what's coming in. And that's part of the resiliency as well. Give people digestible decision support data, or COAs, whatever you want to do. So I think, to me, resiliency has to be defined at the system level, not at the individual piece, because if I make each piece resilient, it's going to be way too expensive. We're never going to get there. But if we think about the checks and balances or the who's going to catch if we mess up here, to me, it's all about defining that resiliency the right way. Nice.
Rob, any thoughts from a Northrop perspective?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. I think it's important to look at the time horizons in which we want to solve certain problems, right? If there's a 27, 28 timeframe problem, if there's a 2030 or 2035, because depending on what specific timeline you're interested in, it sort of predisposes you to certain outcomes. So if it's a 2028 problem, and we're asking for money from Congress now, right? how long is it going to take before you get companies on contract to start building capability, right? And therefore, you're not going to be able to have a 5-year development program to develop a new capability. So therefore, a 2028 timeframe closes the door on a bunch of capabilities. They might be valid for 2030 and 2035, and they may be important and necessary. So I think it's really important to sort of look at those timelines and then say, okay, for a 2028 problem, we're going to need to go and procure capabilities that we have by any number of industry providers and get moving with those, because there's a lead time for everything,
right.
Software, hardware, you name it. And so go get the capabilities that you need, that we need, and then move out with the development programs for the second and third epics, if you want to use that term. I think in terms of defeating the whole range of threats, I think there's a ton of capability that much of industry has. I mean, I can speak for Northrop. We build a large number of solid rocket motors. We have a massive additional capacity that's available that for all sorts of applications. So there's one simple example of where if the nation needs more SRMs, you can buy that from us. Each of us could, give you a business development line of like, here are the things that, we'll take orders at the back of the room. But my point being is that if we sort of peel back the onion and say, what does everybody have today, because we have a 2028 problem, you will find that there's a ton of capability today. Satellites, SRMs, software capabilities, you name it. Then there's the 2030 and 2035, and those are the harder problems to solve that are going to take a little bit longer. We certainly need to be focused on those too. We have always learned this, that we're addressing the problem of the last war. Right? And so what we don't want to find out is in 2028, if only we'd started these other programs back in 2024 and 25 to be ready for a 2030 threat. So judicious decision-making there is really important.
Yeah. Steve, thoughts?
I think in your question about threat volume, I think that is an interesting one. If you try to project forward and think about kind of all the dimensions of that and how would you combat a threat volume challenge, and imagine how we would effectively counter, I think you quickly find yourself in a place where we're having to leverage not only kinetic, non-kinetic, even electronic warfare to be able to avoid saturation, and being able to have all those multiple layers available to draw upon. And just the recognition how different that is the system that we have today, but to make sure that we have, let's say, the depth to maintain the cost exchange trade space. So I think that's absolutely something that comes into play in the future.
Awesome. Okay, Ed.
So look, I'm not going to copy what my colleague said, but I'll leave you with 3 thoughts. I think thing one would be, we're very good at making systems, industry, whatever those systems are. I think the big challenge for us as a nation is really stitching them all together. Is really pulling all of these systems, whether they're space-based, ground-based, wherever they're at, pulling them all together to make sense out of it in order to counter threats that are coming at us real time. I think that's the hardest problem, because we'll make a space sensing layer, we'll provide, munitions. It's really being able to pull all those pieces together to act on, the incoming threats. And I think that's the big work that we've got in front of us as an organization. I think the second thing is the systems that we are providing today need to become smarter. They need to start embedding that AI, ML in the systems, even in the spacecraft. We're looking at, small language models that we can put in spacecraft to do discrimination, to provide, some level of triage before the ground systems have to triage whatever the threats are. I think a great example of that is what MDA is contemplating with the discriminating space sensor, which already starts to look at what's the difference between the actual incoming warhead, the threat, and the chaff and decoys that adversaries may apply. So we need to have smarter systems that help us in the fight. And the third thing, I think Rob touched on it a little bit, is what's the magazine depth that we're going to have as a nation? Because, if you could imagine missile raids coming in, we're going to lead a lot of interceptors to go handle that. And we can't, in day 3 or day 4 have our magazines depleted. And, we not only do we have to have enough magazine depth for us, but of course we provide, munitions to our allied partners. And so I think the whole of industry is seeing the demand signal from the department that more munitions are needed. And I think we're all capacitizing for the demand that we see coming.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think the other thing that, as y'all were talking, I'm going to be interested in y'all's perspective on this, is don't underestimate what we're learning in the Middle East right now. When Iran launches 200 shots at Israel, we're real-time gaining and updating systems today. I don't want anybody to walk away thinking these systems are not up to date. These are some pretty high, we're making them as high-tech as we can. Probably not as fast as we need to, right, for the domestic threat. But I don't know about y'all, but we're getting, we get real-time feedback. In the past, it's all just been test. And so it's not, even though we build these systems to deter, and we don't really want to have to ever use them, when we do use them, it's interesting to see how they're working, what we're learning from them, and how we can play that into the future for the homeland.
Definitely echo that. I think, Robert, I know, credit to Space Force. I know we've done a lot of work taking advantage of kind of those live fire events to collect a lot of data, as he said, and also integrate the integrated tactical warning, attack assessment. I mean, the algorithm just keeps changing based on all this data input, and we've, at this point developed a pretty highly refined capability that will, I think, be a key, building block of whatever the future of continental defense looks like.
That's awesome. So these 4 gentlemen have been answering the questions that I have been intending to ask well before I've had the chance to ask them. They are so good at what they do. So I'm going to throw them, we've got about 8 minutes left, and I'm going to throw them a different kind of question and hear what we can get out of them, because I think this is going to be so interesting. We've already talked about integration, we've talked about industry cooperation, which I think is fantastic. But I think the last thing that I would like to hear from each of you is, what is our biggest hurdle that we face right now to get started and get after this issue? Do we have policy issues? Is it a money issue? Is it a technology? Is it an integration issue, et cetera, et cetera? I'd love it if in each of your last comments for a couple of minutes we could hear about what problems we have to solve before we can solve the problem.
So you're looking at me, so I guess you want me to start.
I'm looking right at you.
Well, look, first of all, I hope we don't end up in a government shutdown. I mean, because thing number one is we need predictability of budgets. I think one of the biggest challenges that the department has, and we have as industry, is budgets are allocated on an annual basis and continue down that path. It becomes difficult to really get the momentum and envision the scale of what we need to do as an organization, as a country. So I think, number one is we need to really make sure that we've resourced it and allocated the budget, and that budget is moving forward with speed. I think that'd be number one. Number two is, and I think Robert and many of my colleagues touched on it, is really let's really define with a fine point the threats that our continental system is trying to defend against. We've talked about these very high-tech threats that are maneuverable. We've also talked about little UAVs that pop out of containers. Is it everything? Is it everything in between? Or is it just the exquisite things? So that's underway. And so as that becomes clear, I think industry will rally around, both those points to deliver what we need as a nation.
All right, Rob?
Yeah, what he said. So right on, Ed, I agree. And we all talk a lot about, how we can solve the problems as best as we can from our vantage points. I would say, predictability, stability, particularly for the new entrants, right? The new players, those folks don't have maybe as much buffer to ride through complexities and contracts being delayed and government funding and CRs and so on. So that is really important. We do collectively need to get going. So if we want to solve 27 and 28 and 29 problems, if there are delays for any number of reasons, right, that's going to delay the ability of the industry to turn around and deliver capability. We can do a certain amount of leaning forward, but there's only a certain amount of leaning forward that can be done. The last thing that I think is really important is national security is a team sport. And we're all in this together, and it's really important that we can all work together. And I've seen a little bit of sort of us and them, new entrants, legacy. We have enough of a problem to solve as a nation that we need to lock our arms together and say, hey, let's collectively figure it out and partner in ways that will help solve the problem versus getting in a, we're better than the other guy competition. Sure. So I would just encourage everyone listening, everyone in the room here that, let's figure out how to get to the right answers for us collectively, because that's what really matters.
I think you're right. Robert?
Yeah, I think, first of all, that last statement is critically important. I mean, almost everything I fly has these two guys or Steve's stuff on it. I mean, we're already partners in so many ways, and there's a completely false narrative out there that we're always competing. We do compete, but we also partner a lot more than everybody talks about. To me, I think the biggest challenge we have here, I'm probably take it up a level, is our risk tolerance. And what I mean by that is I look at risk in a couple of categories. I have two lanes of risk. One is the technical risk for building the systems that we've been asked to build, and then there's an acquisition risk. And I think we've gotten way too focused on the acquisition risk, where we will, pound and ground talcum powder on a T&C in a contract over and over before we award the contract without just saying, look, we'll take that risk. We need to get after it, right? We need to get this going. And that's on both sides, by the way. It's on industry and the government. We have got to realize that we have an acquisition process because we have a mission we need to get done. And sometimes the acquisition process is so legalistic and risk averse, and oh my God, that company might make a little more money than we expected them to make, or whatever it is, or we might say we're going to lose money. That's the part that worries me the most, because it does take a while to get things on contract from both sides. I'm being really clear. It's not just the government, it's the industry as well. That's what we got to attack because we never talk about the risk. When we're doing all that in the acquisition side, we never talk about the risk that we're not getting the mission done. It's opportunity lost. So that's what I think we got to continue to have that dialogue is, hey, are we really arguing about the right things? Because every time we spend in that leg keeps us away from the mission leg.
Yeah, I think you're right. Steve, bring us home.
I'm going to be a little bit redundant, and I think you heard a flavor of this in all of the panel members, but this recurring theme of being saddled to execute these truly high complexity, high consequence missions that are inherently multi-year with the constraint of the annual budget process and the uncertainty there is just, a fundamental incompatibility. And I think if we could somehow, kind of borrowing from Robert, adopt this as, hey, this is, like an Apollo moment, a situation of such national security that we need to be able to break out of that mold and have, multi-year visibility on that. That would, I think, really unlock a lot. And by the way, it's not just about homeland protection. I think there are other missions about right now that well publicized about back to the moon and onto Mars, and so many dimensions associated with, who wins that race. So there are a lot of these high-tech complexity, multi-year, and I think somehow we need to get at that. And the other thing, picking up on Rob's point about the team sport, I just think to get moving and start getting after it, as you're hearing from all the panelists, to how do we, in truth, not just in word, but in truth, create that, joint development enterprise that has all these great companies and government working together to, from the beginning, integrate these capabilities and deploy capability quickly. I think those would be two great things for us to shoot at.
That's awesome. And folks, you heard it here from these amazing industry leaders. So thank you, gentlemen, for a really rich discussion. Continental defense in the 21st century is one of the most complex and consequential challenges our nation faces, and it's clear that meeting it will demand innovation, integration, and true partnership across government and industry. Hopefully, based on what you've seen today, you have a positive outlook. I know I do. If you have a chance, swing by the Mitchell Institute booth to read some of our latest reports on issues of great importance to air and space power. In the meantime, please join me in giving a big thank you to our guests and have a great air and space power kind of day.